So this is Higher Biology Unit 3, Sustainability and Interdependence, and we start off with photosynthesis and plant and animal breeding, and then there's a section in the middle where we have a look at animal welfare, particularly if we're providing using animals for food, and then towards the end we then look at social behaviour, so between primates and also between ants and bees, and then finally we finish off by looking at biodiversity. So Unit 3.1, food supply, plant growth and production, but essentially this one is, it's photosynthesis, but we're relating it to food. So what you need to be able to do for this first part, so I think I've split this into four different sessions. So this first bit, define food security and describe the concerns which surround it, and then describe the ideal ways of increasing food production, and then the last one is to explain why livestock produce less food per unit area than crops. So in 20 minutes, half an hour from now, you should be able to do each of these. So food security, just as a definition, is the ability of human populations to access food of sufficient quality and quantity. And here it is here demonstrated by the Venn diagram, and you have also access in here, but yeah, it's not just to have enough food, it needs to be of. And as you can imagine, food security is under threat for various reasons, and climate change of course comes into the mix here. But if you look at a graph of human population growth of the last 2,000 years, you can see that since the Industrial Revolution, when numbers have started to increase and people have lived longer, there's a growing population, and as a consequence of that, there is more of a demand on providing food for everybody, which has an impact on habitats and various different ecosystems. And it also requires people to kind of think of innovative ways to get food to everybody and produce food for everybody. So this video is something worth having a look at. We take for granted that we don't have to spend too much money on food, but there are countries around the world where it's very expensive. So have a read of this. Watch this. So this is a wee exercise I quite like to do. I mean, it doesn't have anything to do with higher biology really, does it? But this is just to give you an idea. You're getting to that stage of your life where you have to spend, it's not going to be too long until you have to spend money on things and try and budget. So this is, I believe when I did this, this was the average salary in the UK, so 26,500. And for your average person, this is maybe what they might be spending in terms of money. So your tax, which comes out your wage, your national insurance, which comes out your wage, maybe you get a pension, paying for where you live, council tax, if you've got a car, etc, etc, etc. So a wee bit of maths and various other questions. So I want you to just have a look, have a go, have a go at these few questions. So press pause and do that. So if you've been through this, you'll see that between 2 and 3, if you live in China and you're spending 34% of your salary on food, then if going by what we've got here, you're going to be pretty tight. So for number 4, it was just to get you thinking about what you would have to get rid of if you had to accommodate the increase. Something which some of you might have thought of as well. This would be if you think about your parents, maybe your the older brothers and sisters, they might live. This is going to be shared. So if you've got a mortgage in the flat and there's a couple of people living in it, then obviously that's going to be halved. These are individual, but down here, quite a lot of these other expenses will be shared with other people, so it might not be quite so difficult to budget, but certainly if you were living alone, then these would be, you'd have to consider where you were going to put your money. So for future food production, so think about what the missing words might be. It has to be sustainable, and at the same time, you don't want to degrade the natural resources that agriculture depends on. So you want to try and avoid erosion. I think if you've done geography, you might know about crop rotation. So you want to try and ensure that the quality of the soil remains good, so you can continue to farm and produce crops in these various areas. So here's again just a wee scenario. You're a farmer of potatoes whose livelihood is at stake because your yield has steadily decreased year on year. Aphids, so that's green fly, eat your crop. The potatoes also deteriorate because of blight, which is a fungus, and you spend much of your time removing weeds. So what strategies could be employed to improve yield? So pause, have a wee think about that. What could be done? So thinking about the potato farmer and his situation and what was threatening his crop yield, you might have I'm hoping that you maybe have a thought as to what these might be. So put down numbers 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 and see if you can write down what the answers are. Press pause. So maybe a new word here, that's cultivars. So these are cultivated crops. So you'd want to choose a crop which has a particularly high yield. That would make sense. Something that aids growth. Remember this from National 5. Contains nitrates, NPK ratio might have been mentioned, so you can use fertiliser to aid growth. To kill pests, number 3, that would be a pesticide, or you could have an insecticide there. To reduce disease, so the disease that was mentioned for the potato farmer was blight, which is a fungus, so fungicides could be used as well. And number 5, to reduce competition from weeds, you could use herbicides. So quite a lot of chemicals involved here. It's not quite organic farming, is it? But these are methods of increasing plant growth. Okay, so at the start, one of the learning intentions was talking about the difference between eating sort of livestock and eating crops. So why is it more energy efficient for humans to eat crops rather than livestock? So what do you think? Here's a food chain here, pyramid of biomass, which you hopefully remember from National 5. So the answer, why is it more energy efficient? Well, if you think about it, energy is lost between each level, each what's called trophic level in the food web or the food chain. So if you eat the crops directly, then there's going to be less energy lost. Okay. On the other side of it though, livestock against plant crops, livestock production, if you're trying to plant crops, you're really relying on the ground and the soil being, an appropriate moisture level, appropriate pH and so on. You can't just plant crops and expect them to grow well regardless of where you are. So if the conditions aren't great for growing certain crops, then your alternative then is to have livestock, is to put livestock in the land because they don't need much, so livestock production is often possible in habitats unsuitable for growing crops. And you know yourself, I mean, a lot of the fruit and veg that you have in your kitchen are not, we can't grow them in this country, they have to be imported. So in some areas this would be an option. Instead of growing crops, just allow cattle, sheep to graze on it. So as I was kind of alluding to before, so you can have the livestock don't produce as much food because you've got the loss of energy between trophic levels. So in an ideal world, to be most energy efficient, you'd want, I suppose, more of a plant-based diet, or however, if you're maybe in an area where the land isn't great, then that would maybe be sensible to shift to livestock. Now, quite often I will buy online edible insects and bring them into class, and I'm always surprised that the people in the class who are quite keen on it, and others think they might not be quite so keen, and then they quite enjoy them. Quite nutty actually, some of them. I think the crickets went down quite well. So if we've got an issue with food, potentially in the future, maybe we need to think about what we eat. And there's lots of insects about, isn't there? So watch this video. So here is an example. So edible insects full of protein, omega-3, vitamin B12, and there's crickets. And yeah, as I mentioned, mild and nutty flavour. Try roasting and seasoning for a healthy snack. So quite expensive at the moment, but you know, who knows? Maybe your children in the future this will be normal to them. We turn up our noses at it, but maybe this is the way things are going to go. You just don't know. Certainly a good source of energy, and there's plenty of insects. And this is on the packaging for this. This just for those insects, it just gives you an idea of the the differences. So if you're producing cattle for 1 kilogram of protein, there's your greenhouse gas emissions. And in terms of the protein, iron, calcium, crickets provide more. In terms of the litres of water required for animals, insects here compared to 22,000 litres compared to 1 litre for an insect. So certainly in terms of environmental reasons, for nutritional reasons, it would make sense. That's something in a sieve, which doesn't look that appetising, but I mean that looks alright, doesn't it? You could probably eat that, particularly if it was closed over. So yeah, watch this space. Maybe in supermarkets in the near future there'll be an insect aisle. Okay, so have a break, and then when you rejoin, we'll then go on to photosynthesis. Okay, so just a bit of revision from last time. So there's your starter question, so press pause and write down the answers. First of all, the reason why the food production needs to be increased is because we have got a growing human population. You can go on there's all these websites where it knows the number of humans being born every second, and you can just see the number continuously increasing. So we require more food. Methods of doing that, there's a few. So use particular crops which have got a high yield, and then after that you're kind of getting into the territory of using chemicals. So fertilizers, I suppose it could just be manure, so that's a natural fertilizer, or pesticides, fungicides, herbicides. So just kind of spelling out the obvious here, but food production is dependent upon photosynthesis. So over here we have got some kind of staple foods, I suppose. So you've got your cereals, potato, a source of many of our different foods that we eat. You've got your root vegetables as well, and you have got legumes. So all of these different types of plant carry out photosynthesis, which brings the energy into the ecosystem, and ultimately the energy for us to survive. And here's another YouTube video, so search for that, photosynthesis in food, and have a watch. Now a bit of a revision, I'm hoping you can do these. So this is going back to S1 and S2. Can you write down just a general equation for photosynthesis? So you should have two substances probably on either side of the arrow. So think of things that plants need, think of things that plants produce, and then a stage on from that. Number two, let's see if you can remember this. So when you go into a bit more detail, we have got the light reactions in photosynthesis, and then we've got carbon fixation. Can you remember that? Maybe a couple of flowcharts, diagrams would be good. So photosynthesis, the general equation is CO2, carbon dioxide plus water, and it gets turned into sugar, or you could have glucose here plus oxygen. And light, quite often you'll see light energy written above the arrow because it's the light energy which allows this to happen. Where is it happening in the plant? Remember this? So it's happening in the chloroplasts of the plant cells, and there is also a pigment within the chloroplasts. Sounds a bit like chloroplasts. If you remember that, it's chlorophyll. So chlorophyll and the chloroplasts, they trap the light energy and they convert it into another form of energy, which is chemical energy, ATP. So there's your chloroplast there, and there is a nice image of them. They are green, and we'll explain why they're green just in a moment. Okay, level up from that. So at NAT5, stage 1, the light reactions. So you have light energy, which does two things. So first of all, it splits water into oxygen and hydrogen, so H2O into O2, H2, and also it's just converted into ATP. And we've got the battery here because ATP is a bit like an energy store when cells require energy to carry out active transport or mitosis or whatever, they then use their store of ATP. So light energy is trapped by chlorophyll, which is in chloroplasts, then converted to ATP, which is the chemical energy, and the ATP goes into stage 2. Meanwhile, light energy is also splitting water into oxygen, hydrogen. Now, we're totally dependent on plants for food. But something else which is not to be forgotten is that if it wasn't for plants, we wouldn't have the 20% oxygen in our atmosphere, which we require to survive. We need it to carry out respiration. And this is just a waste product for them. So if you've got underwater plants, you'll see oxygen bubbles coming off the leaves. This is just waste. And that waste product that that's been put into the atmosphere has allowed us to evolve. So think about that as well. Oxygen's waste for them, but totally essential for us. And from these, oxygen is waste, hydrogen isn't, so hydrogen goes on to stage 2. And stage 2 at NAT5 level looks like this. So we've got our hydrogen and ATP coming from stage 1, and then carbon dioxide, which was in our original equation. We haven't mentioned that yet. So carbon, oxygen combines with hydrogen, and ATP provides the energy, and we have your sugar produced, glucose, which is carbohydrate, carbon, oxygen, hydrogen, carbohydrate. And as ever, biological processes, enzymes are key. So that was a bit of revision of what you should know already. Moving this into higher level, the first thing to do is look at absorption spectra. So we're going to compare the absorption spectra of chlorophyll A and B and the carotenoids. So some new terms here with the photosynthesis action spectra. That sounds a bit scary, but I'll break it down. So the first thing to say is that when you've got light coming from the sun, there are three things that can happen to it when it reaches the leaf. So the first one is that it can be absorbed, and that is the light that will be used for photosynthesis. It can be transmitted, so this arrow denotes the light going straight through it, or it can be reflected. Okay, and it's the absorbed light that we're concerned about. Okay, so light striking a leaf may be A absorbed, R reflected, or T transmitted. So if you were asked the three things that happen to light hitting a leaf, ART is the way to remember: absorbed, A, reflected, R, T transmitted. So that light that's absorbed by the pigments, we can say now that there are three pigments. So they are chlorophyll A, chlorophyll B, and carotenoids. And when the pigments absorb this, they generate ATP and also for photolysis. And I'll explain what photolysis is shortly. So you might think, well, what is the point of having three pigments? Why are they there? And the reason is, you can sort of see from this graph here, is that they absorb light at different wavelengths. So this is your, remember this from S1, S2 physics. So this is your Roy G. Biv going backwards, so the different wavelengths of light. And here is the absorption. So you can see that chlorophyll B mostly absorbs in the blue part of the spectrum. Carotenoids are kind of between blue and green, and then chlorophyll A and also a bit of chlorophyll B will also do a bit of absorption at the other end of the spectrum, which is the orange and red end. So by having various pigments, this means that you have increased light being absorbed because they've got a range of wavelengths. So that's what's called the absorption spectrum, and then this is what we'd call the action spectrum, and this is the rate of photosynthesis at the different wavelengths. And this, it follows, doesn't it? So you can see that where the light energy is being absorbed at these two ends of the spectrum, that's where you've got the highest rate of photosynthesis. Okay. Something else that's noticeable as well, you can see that at the green part of the spectrum, light isn't absorbed. So this is why leaves appear green, because it's reflected in that part of the spectrum. Okay, so absorption spectrum is the wavelengths of light at which the three pigments absorb the energy, and then the action spectrum is the rate of photosynthesis at different wavelengths. So if you were to shine light onto a leaf at 550 nanometers, you're not going to have a high rate of photosynthesis because the pigments are not absorbing the light. Whereas if you shone 450 nanometer wavelength light on it, then chlorophyll B and also carotenoid is going to be a bit active around there as well. They're going to be absorbing it, so you will have a higher rate. So when absorption of light by pigments increases, the rate of photosynthesis increases. So you can see how this corresponds there. And just to kind of relate this to, you sometimes see this in a past paper question. So just have a read of this. So what will happen is you might see an experiment where they're measuring the rate of photosynthesis, and what they'll do is they'll have something like, they'll have a bicarbonate indicator in there, and it will change colour as a result of photosynthesis occurring. So just to be aware, you might see that sometimes as a measure of the rate of photosynthesis, you'll have colorimeter readings. So that you can see here, the closer the light source is to the tube, the higher the colorimeter reading, and as you move it away as it becomes darker and darker, the colorimeter reading goes down. So carotenoids, remember chlorophyll A, chlorophyll B and carotenoids. So carotenoids, their role is just to extend that range of wavelengths, and they pass the energy on to the chlorophyll for photosynthesis. Okay, have a break there. When we come back, we've looked at the absorption of light by the three pigments. So the next part is to then get into the nitty-gritty of the stages of photosynthesis at a higher level. So revision from the last lesson. So try these, number 1 and 2. Press pause. So first one, light that strikes a leaf can either be absorbed, reflected or transmitted, ART. And the three pigments that absorb light energy are chlorophyll A, chlorophyll B and carotenoids, and the way in which they differ is that they absorb light at different wavelengths. I don't think you need to know specifically, in fact I know that you don't need to know where exactly on the spectrum they are absorbing light, you just have to know that they will absorb light at different wavelengths. So then, getting into photosynthesis, so our stages for this are the light-dependent stages and the Calvin cycle. And also something else you need to be able to do, you produce glucose, and you might remember from National 5, there's various things a plant will do with the glucose, and the terminology of the course, we say the fates of glucose, so you need to be able to say what they do. So this was the light reactions from Nat 5 level. So light energy splits water into oxygen and hydrogen, or is converted into ATP. And the ATP goes on to stage 2. And this was the other part of it. So light energy splits water into oxygen and hydrogen. Oxygen's waste, and then hydrogen goes on to stage 2. Okay, so at higher level, this might look a bit familiar, and if you've already got sort of respiration sorted out in your head, the electron transport chain, this is very similar. So here is light energy, and in the first part of this, what happens is you can see the electrons move along the membrane. As a result of that, hydrogen ions move across the membrane. This provides the energy for that to happen. Then number 3, hydrogen ions come back across the membrane, activating ATP synthase to produce ATP. Okay, so ADP plus PI produces ATP. So exactly the same thing as respiration. Okay, and at the same time, we can also say that light energy is carrying out this process, so it's splitting water into hydrogen and oxygen. Okay, so in respiration, we had your sort of NAD was coming in here, and it was carrying hydrogen ions and electrons. This time, the source of the energy is light energy. Okay. So, see if you can do this. Put down numbers 1 to 8. Press pause. Number 1, absorbed light energy excites electrons in number 2, pigment molecules. Remember, we're in the pigment here. Number 2, transfer of electrons through an electron transport chain drives the transfer of hydrogen ions across the chloroplast membrane. And remember, hydrogen ions is just a hydrogen atom which is lost an electron, so it's an H+. That's the kind of chemistry of it. For higher biology, you don't need to know that, but that's what an ion is, just an atom which has lost an electron, has become, well, if it's a positive ion, it's lost an electron, but not particularly important. So that's the hydrogen ions go across the chloroplast membrane, and then the third one, the return of 5 is hydrogen ions, drives ATP synthase to produce ATP. Okay, so that's one thing that's going on. It's light-dependent reactions. The second thing, the light energy is also used to split something into oxygen and hydrogen. So 7 is water. And this word, if you've had a look at your notes, or it was mentioned earlier, this process is called photolysis. So splitting water into oxygen and hydrogen is photolysis, and oxygen is released into the atmosphere. Okay. Now, the hydrogen produced, it becomes, hopefully you can work this out. So NADH, you'll remember from respiration, I think, in Unit 1. So here we've got NADPH. So hydrogen becomes bound to the coenzyme something to produce NADPH. So to turn, what do you think it would be? If NAD becomes NADH, then number 9, NADP produces NADPH. Okay. And NADPH and then something else passed on to stage 2. Number 10 is ATP. So NADPH and ATP go into stage 2, which is called the Calvin cycle. So just a way to remember this, to not get them mixed up, you've got an electron transport chain to talk about in photosynthesis and in respiration, and you've got these coenzymes involved. So the one in respiration is NAD, the one in photosynthesis is NADP. So P, for a way to remember it, P for photosynthesis, just to differentiate the two. Now here's your NAT5 photosynthesis, stage 2. So we had hydrogen coming in with ATP and being added onto carbon dioxide to produce the sugar, which is glucose. So that's the kind of very simple version. So we now know that the hydrogen is coming in is being provided by NADPH. So higher level. So what happens in stage 2? So remember, we haven't talked about our carbon dioxide yet. So remember the basic equations. So you've got your carbon dioxide plus water producing oxygen and glucose. So the carbon dioxide in the Calvin cycle combines with a substance called ribulose bisphosphate, RUBP. Then we've got another new enzyme coming into the course. Rubisco converts this into 3-phosphoglycerate, or 3-PG. And I should point out, you don't, if you want, you can just do you don't need to do the full names. You can do the shortened versions if you want. 3-phosphoglycerate gets turned into glyceraldehyde 3-phosphate, and have a think about what's going on here. So NADPH gets converted into NADP plus H. ATP is providing something here, it's doing something. I'm wondering if you can remember that from respiration as well. And you get glyceraldehyde 3-phosphate. And it finally is converted into your end product, which is glucose. And this is, if you've got glyceraldehyde 3-phosphate, it can also be converted back into ribulose bisphosphate. Okay, so get ready, see if you can remember what's going on here. So here's numbers 11 to 17, press pause and do that. Number 1, the enzyme Rubisco is 11, fixes carbon dioxide by attaching it to RUBP is ribulose bisphosphate. This produces 3-phosphoglycerate, and the 3-phosphoglycerate produced is something by ATP. So this is a term which means that the ATP donates its phosphate group. Do you remember that? So it's phosphorylated. So it's phosphorylated by ATP and combined with something from NADPH. So NADPH is the coenzyme. What is it providing again? It's brought something from the light-dependent reactions, and that is hydrogen. So 14 is hydrogen, and then this produces G3P, which is glyceraldehyde 3-phosphate. It's easy to get these mixed up, isn't it? It's the same number and letters, just the other way around. I suppose if you're trying to remember which one comes first, it's the number, the 3PG comes before the G3P, so the number before the letter. And then G3P is used to make our final product, which 16 is glucose, or to regenerate 17, which is RUBP, ribulose bisphosphate. So that is our 2 stages, the light-dependent reactions and then the Calvin cycle. So our sugar produced, 3 different things that can happen to it at NAT5 that we talked about. So it can be used immediately for respiration, and this is one of these common misconceptions. The students might think animals carry out respiration, whereas plants carry out photosynthesis. Plants carry out respiration too. So they'll use that immediately because they carry out mitosis and various other processes that require energy. Alternatively, if they've got an excess, then they'll turn the glucose into starch, that's a storage carbohydrate, or they could turn it into cellulose, which is part of plant cell walls. And higher doesn't really move too much beyond that, so we just kind of change the language a wee bit. So it can be used for respiration or used as a respiratory substrate, turned into starch, turned into cellulose, and the new one that hasn't been mentioned before at National 5 is it can get passed on to other pathways. So it can be used for other metabolic pathways, for example, in the production of proteins. So that is the stages of photosynthesis. So what I would like you to do is, and this maybe requires quite a large bit of paper, but just try and get these stages into your head. So, don't know, big bit of A3 paper, split it in two, maybe the left-hand side, stage 1. So describe stage 1 of photosynthesis, so include the words electrons, hydrogen ions, ATP, photolysis, and NADP. You can draw a diagram. And then for the next one, use 6 arrows and a plus sign and the words below to make stage 2, which is the Calvin cycle of photosynthesis. So just try and put these all in the correct place. You might want to do some descriptions as well, for example, what ATP provides. Okay, so have a go at that. Spend a while just trying to draw that out as much as you can from memory, and then once you've got it down on a bit of paper, go back to an earlier point in this video and see how close you are. Okay, press pause and do that. Okay, hopefully you've checked your, you've gone back and checked your poster with what you should have for the stages of photosynthesis, and if you've done that, it's time for a break, and then next time you come back to this video, we'll just do some revision and look at some past paper questions. Okay, so just a bit of revision, just see what you remember. So press pause and do these, match A to E with the numbers. So A, Rubisco is 2, the enzyme which combines CO2 and RUBP. B, ATP synthase is the enzyme activated by the flow of hydrogen ions. C, photolysis is 3, the splitting of water using light energy. G3, so these two are the ones you might you might get the wrong way around. So remember I said before the one with the number comes first, 3pg. So G3p, it's the one that's converted to glucose. I suppose that's another way of doing it, isn't it? G for glucose, so G3p gets turned into glucose, or used to regenerate RUBP, which leaves 3pg, which E is 1, which is a product of CO2 and RUBP reacting. So this is from the 2017 exam. Press pause, try this. During photosynthesis, light energy is absorbed by photosynthetic pigments in the chloroplast. State one fate of the light which is not absorbed by the photosynthetic pigments. Two options for that, either reflected or transmitted. For the next one, what does the light energy do? So it excites electrons in the pigments, or you might have said produces higher energy electrons. The next one, part 3, broadens the absorption or the action spectrum, or allows a wider range of wavelengths of light to be absorbed. And then part B, it is water, or photolysis of water. And then finally C, so passes hydrogen to 3-phosphoglycerate, or passes hydrogen to form G3P. Either one of those would probably be what you would go for. And just to finish off, let's have a go at one of these. So there's 15 mistakes in this. This is the 2 stages of photosynthesis. So press pause, write down what the mistake is. So each mistake is one word, and put in the correct word. Okay, so the first paragraph, in the light-dependent stage, absorbed chemical energy excites electrons in pigment molecules. That is wrong, that should be light energy. Then the next one, movement of electrons drives the transfer of hydrogen ions across the chloroplast membrane. Then the return flow of hydroxide ions, that's not right, it should be hydrogen ions, drives dehydrogenase to produce ATP. It's not dehydrogenase, that should be ATP synthase. The chemical energy also splits oxygen into water and hydrogen, so that shouldn't be chemical, that should be light energy. Okay, the light energy also splits water into oxygen and hydrogen, so there's a few mistakes in there. Next paragraph, water is released into the atmosphere. No, it is not. Oxygen is released into the atmosphere. Hydrogen becomes bound to the coenzyme NAP, That's not right. That should be NADP. And then if you've found out that mistake, then there's two more coming up, isn't there? So to produce, that should be NADPH, and then again, NADPH and ATP are passed on to stage 2, the Calvin cycle. So in the Calvin cycle, Rubisco fixes carbon dioxide by attaching it to 3-phosphoglycerate. That is wrong, isn't it? That should be ribulose bisphosphate. And then here again, you can see that these are the wrong way around. So then that should be the 3-PG, the 3-phosphoglycerate produced is phosphorylated by ADP. Nope, ATP. That should be, and combined with hydrogen to form NAPH. Nope, that should be NADPH. NADPH to form G3P. G3P is used to make starch or to regenerate ribulose bisphosphate. It's not used to make starch, it's used to make glucose. And that is it. This part here, the stages of photosynthesis, that is the kind of main chunk of it, I suppose, this topic. But you also need to be able to know about the kind of action spectrum, what the pigments do and so on, and also right at the start relate it to, increasing food production for humans. That's us. Okay, I thought that was us, that is not us. So I think this is the last one. So yeah, press pause and try this. So it's just to, sometimes people get mixed up between respiration and photosynthesis. So just to try and separate them in your mind, press pause and try this. Okay, so respiration, its purpose is to break down glucose to produce ATP, whereas photosynthesis, it uses light energy to split water and fix CO2 into glucose. So you're breaking down glucose for respiration, whereas photosynthesis, you're producing it. Respiration, just be careful because it's actually two locations. Remember, you've got stage 1 in the cytoplasm, and then you've got mitochondria. Photosynthesis, we're in chloroplasts. The simple equation are like so. You just reverse them. The names of the stages, so in respiration, you've got glycolysis, the citric acid cycle, and the electron transport chain. And then photosynthesis is the light-dependent stage, or the light reactions, and then the Calvin cycle. And respiration is all organisms, I think, pretty much. And then photosynthesis is plants, as well as some bacteria, which are photosynthetic.